There is a question that traverses centuries of religious tradition and that few stop to examine closely. What happened to the women who married fallen angels? The most common answer is that we don't know, as if it were merely a plot hole. But when we enter the ancient texts with a magnifying glass, we realize that this silence is no accident. It is the very mechanism of the tradition. Why were some destinies preserved in dramatic detail while others were carefully erased? If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the moment. Warning: this documentary uses AI-generated images for illustrative purposes. Although the visuals are synthetic, the content is the fruit of rigorous research based on real historical and scientific sources. Sources in the description. In a preserved copy of the text of Enoch, there is a passage that has always drawn attention. The scribe describes how the Watchers descended, united with the daughters of men, begot the giants, and were subsequently judged. But when the time comes to narrate the consequences for the women, something strange happens. The text simply changes the subject. It speaks of the imprisoned angels, the dead giants, the spirits that remain afflicting, the earth. The mothers vanish from the narrative exactly when they should appear. Notice this detail. It is not that the text forgot them. It is that it chose not to follow that trail. To understand the weight of this choice, we need to go back to the oldest records. The canonical version, preserved in what we know today as Genesis, is brutally economical. It records that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, took wives for themselves, and begot the Nephilim. After that, the narrative jumps straight to the general corruption of the earth and to the flood. The women enter as a point of contact between two worlds, but they do not gain a biography, a name, or a specific destiny. This textual economy is already information. When an ancient text decides to preserve only the minimal core of an episode, it is making an editorial choice. What is worth remembering? The transgression, the cosmic consequences, the divine response. The human detail is left out, not through carelessness, but through focus. Follow this contrast with me. Centuries later, when the Jewish tradition of the Second Temple period decides to expand the story, it does exactly the opposite. The set of texts attributed to Enoch transforms the episode into a complete drama. It gives names to the angels, lists the forbidden knowledge they taught, describes the violence of the giants, narrates the celestial judgment, and explains the consequences that extend until the end of times. It is an impressive expansion. But here appears the contradiction that sustains our entire investigation. Precisely where the tradition decides to tell more, it continues to divert focus from the women. They appear at the beginning of the story, but rarely receive what we could call narrative right. The right to have their own destiny reported. Try to visualize the scene. In certain preserved versions, the Watchers are presented as 200 angels who descended on Mount Hermon, made a pact among themselves, and divided to seduce the daughters of men. The text describes the chiefs by name: Azazel, Semjaza, Armaros, Barakijal. Some teach metallurgy, others astrology, others still sorcery and war. From this union, the giants are born, creatures of uncommon size that begin to devour everything that exists on the earth. Up to this point, the women are still present in the narrative, but as receivers of knowledge and mothers of the creatures. The text does not blame them directly for the initial transgression that belongs to the angels, but neither does it absolve them of the consequences. They remain in a morally ambiguous zone. They are human, but they carry children who are not entirely human. They are victims of angelic seduction, but also beneficiaries of forbidden knowledge. And then something happens that changes the entire dynamic of the story. The giants begin to destroy the world. In manuscripts preserved from antiquity, they are described not only as strong, but as systematic predators. They devour the fruits of the earth, then the animals. Then they begin to feed on one another and finally turn against humans. What began as a union between worlds turns into a nightmare of uncontrolled violence. Think about this. The women who bore these creatures are watching their sons become the main threat to human survival. It is not just the terror of seeing the child grow too strong. It is the horror of seeing the child turn into a predator of the very species that gave origin to his mother. In psychological terms, this is pure devastation, but the texts do not stop to explore this side of the tragedy. Instead, they go straight to the celestial reaction. God orders the archangels to imprison the watchers and eliminate the giants. The description of the judgment of the angels is detailed. They are bound and thrown into prisons of darkness, where they will remain until the day of final judgment. Some texts even specify the locations, desert valleys where they remain shackled under rough rocks. For the giants, the sentence is immediate death. They must be eliminated because they represent a distortion of the created order. Up to here, the logic is clear. The angels transgressed. The hybrids threaten human existence. Heaven intervenes to restore order. But then, an element arises that complicates everything. In preserved late versions, the death of the giants does not end the problem. The text of Enoch introduces an idea that will influence centuries of religious thought. The spirits of the giants do not disappear with the death of the body. They remain as wandering and aggressive entities associated with the affliction of common humans. Notice the twist. If the sons after death continue existing as an afflicting presence, then the bond between them and the mothers is not broken by physical elimination. In other words, the women do not just lose children, they lose the right to normal mourning. They cannot weep for a definitive absence because what they bore continues to be present, only now in a totally hostile form. This is the most disturbing part of the entire reconstruction. Ancient traditions frequently mention that the spirits of the giants became demons that afflict humanity with diseases, nightmares, violence, and moral corruption. If we accept the internal logic of the texts, this means that the mothers not only watched the fall of the world because of their sons, but also became associated forever with the origin of a spiritual category that the tradition considers evil. Before proceeding, pay attention to this asymmetry. The texts bothered to describe with dramatic details the destiny of the angels and the destiny of the giants, both in life and in death. For the angels, eternal prison. For the giants, physical death, followed by afflicting spiritual existence. But for the women, almost total silence. Some copies that survive time make sparse references. In certain manuscripts, there are indications that they survived the flood. After all, if the memory of the episode remained, it is because someone transmitted it. But there is no narrative about how they dealt with the loss, if they were socially rejected, if they maintained any knowledge of the angelic teachings, or if they suffered any specific type of punishment. And here is where the investigation gets interesting, because this gap is not casual. It reveals something about how the tradition functions when it needs to explain the origin of evil. Evil in this model must have a clear cause and an explainable continuity. The cause is the angels who transgress. The continuity is the spirits that persist. The human women remain in an intermediate position. They are the necessary link for the transgression to happen, but they are not the main engine of the narrative. In oral traditions preserved in fragmented form, there are some echoes of what their social destiny might have been. Certain lineages are mentioned as carriers of specific knowledge, advanced metallurgy, astronomy, medicine with plants. It is possible that the women preserved and transmitted part of the angelic teachings, but always in a clandestine manner, because this knowledge was associated with the original transgression. Perhaps the most precise question is not what specific punishment did they receive, but rather, why were they narratively erased just when the text decides to detail everything else? This choice reveals a priority. The tradition wanted to explain the persistence of evil, not preserve a human memorial of the victims or accomplices of the transgression. Think about the difference. If the text had given names to the women, told their dilemmas, described how they reacted to the violence of their sons, this would generate individual empathy. Individual empathy complicates the didactic function of the myth. When you transform a person into a symbol, the symbol works better if it does not have a detailed biography. Biographies generate nuances. Symbols work better when they are direct. And here appears a strong clue about what really happened to them, at least in terms of social function. They likely became what every community fears in times of moral crisis. Mothers of something that should not exist, not necessarily in the supernatural sense, but in the social sense. They carry the mark of having borne the threat. In marginal notes of later copies, there are indications that certain traditions associated them with the knowledge of dangerous arts. Not fantastic magic, but knowledge that the community considered destabilizing. War, metallurgy, toxic substances, techniques of seduction, astronomy applied to divination. If this line of interpretation is correct, then their destiny was not a unique supernatural sentence, but a lasting social stigma. And this makes sense with the general pattern of the texts. They are not interested in individual justice. They are interested in explaining why the world contains hostile forces and how these forces perpetuate themselves. In this explanatory model, the women occupy a specific role. They are the human memory of the transgression. They cannot be eliminated because they are human, but neither can they be totally absolved because they carry the connection to what was begotten. Follow this reasoning. If the spirits of the giants continue afflicting humanity, then the story is not just about a past event. It is about a matrix that remains active. And the women, as the human point of origin of this matrix, remain symbolically trapped between two conditions. They are not judged directly like the angels, but neither are they freed from association with the disaster. Some ancient accounts transmitted in fragmented form suggest that they maintained a marginal existence, not integrated normally into communities, but also not expelled completely. Perhaps preserving specific knowledge, perhaps serving as a living reminder of the danger of crossing boundaries between the human and the divine. The most disturbing part is that this intermediate condition fits perfectly into the internal logic of the texts. If the objective of the narrative is to warn against transgressions that corrupt the natural order, then it is useful to keep the human witnesses alive, but in an ambiguous situation. They become the sign that certain boundaries must not be crossed and that certain seductions have lasting consequences. But there is another layer in the investigation that deserves attention. When we compare the canonical versions with the later expansions, it becomes clear that different traditions had different priorities when preserving the episode. The oldest version is raw and direct. There was a union. Giants were born. The earth was corrupted. The flood came. Period. There is no space for individual psychology or specific destinies. The expanded versions, however, show a community that felt a need to explain more. Why did the angels do this? How exactly did the giants corrupt the earth? What happened to the spiritual forces involved? Why does evil persist even after divine intervention? These are questions that a developed religious community would naturally ask. and the answers the texts offer are sophisticated. The angels transgress through lust and arrogance. The giants became predators because their hybrid nature had no moral brakes. The spiritual forces persist because the death of the body does not eliminate the corrupted soul. But note that even in these expansions, the women continue to be treated more as a condition of the episode than as historical subjects. They are necessary for the story to happen, but they are not the focus of the moral explanation. The focus is on the agents of the transgression, the angels, and on the lasting consequences, the afflicting spirits. This suggests that the silence about their destiny was not accidental or due to disinterest. It was a conscious literary choice. Giving too much prominence to the women could divert attention from the main point, explaining how a category of hostile spiritual beings arose that continue to influence the human world. In some later traditions, there are indications that they were associated with the origin of specific practices of protection against these spirits, as if the knowledge of how to deal with the affliction caused by the sons had been preserved precisely by the mothers. But even this is mentioned laterally, never as a main narrative, and perhaps this is the most revealing point of the entire investigation. The women did not disappear completely from the records. They were reallocated to a specific function within the tradition. Instead of being characters with their own biography, they became part of the explanation regarding the continuity of the problem. They are the human link to an origin that cannot be totally forgotten, but that also cannot be celebrated. Before trying to reconstruct what this meant in practice, it is worth thinking about why this function was important for the communities that preserved these texts. Religious communities need to explain why evil exists and why it persists even after divine interventions. The model offered by these traditions is elegant. Evil has a specific origin, angelic transgression, and an explainable continuity, hybrid spirits that do not die normally. In this model, the women function as proof that the origin was real and human, not merely mythical. They anchor the story in the physical world, but they also function as a warning that certain seductions have consequences that traverse generations. Not only in the sense of genetic descent, but in the sense of lasting spiritual influence. It is possible that, in the practical life of ancient communities, this translated into a specific type of social position. Perhaps they became specialists in dealing with spiritual afflictions. After all, no one knew the nature of these forces better than those who had borne them. Perhaps they developed practices of protection, purification, or exorcism based on direct experience with the problem. But it is also possible that they carried a permanent stigma. In societies where lineage and spiritual purity were fundamental, being associated with the origin of demonic forces would not be an easy mark to bear. Even if they were not directly guilty of the initial transgression, they would remain as a living reminder that certain boundaries were crossed and that the consequences are still active. The investigation into the texts suggests that both possibilities may have coexisted. Some traditions preserved the idea that they maintained useful knowledge. Others preserved the idea that they were dangerous by association. What seems consistent is that they never returned to occupy a normal position within the social order. The transgression had marked them permanently, and here we reach a central point of our reconstruction. The destiny of the women who married fallen angels may not have been a unique and definitive sentence, but rather a lasting social condition. They became living witnesses of an episode that the tradition needed to preserve as a warning, but which was also dangerous to celebrate or detail too much. Notice how this fits into the logic of the texts. If the function of the narrative is to explain the origin of hostile spiritual forces and warn against similar transgressions, then keeping the original mothers in an ambiguous position is narratively useful. They serve as proof that the story really happened, but also as an example that certain seductions have complicated and lasting consequences. In this sense, the silence about the specific details of their destiny is not a gap to be filled, but rather a textual strategy to be understood. The text is not trying to tell the individual biography of the women. It is trying to preserve an explanation about the persistence of evil that is useful for future generations. But this raises a disturbing question. What happens to individual human experience when it is absorbed by the symbolic function of a myth? The real women, if there were real women behind this tradition, cease to exist as persons and pass to exist only as part of a theological explanation. And perhaps that is exactly what the texts are describing, even without saying it explicitly. Their destiny was to be transformed from persons into symbols, from mothers into warnings, from individuals into components of a larger narrative about the origin and continuity of evil in the world. The absence of a specific biography for the women in the main texts does not mean they disappeared completely from the tradition. It means they were preserved in a different form, more fragmented and indirect, in marginal notes of later manuscripts, in oral traditions scattered about, and in texts that seem to touch upon the subject without touching it directly. There are indications of what might have happened. They are not definitive proofs, but they are clues consistent enough to allow a plausible reconstruction. One of the most interesting lines appears in copies that survived time of texts regarding lineages and genealogies. Certain families are mentioned as carriers of specific knowledge that did not have a common human origin, advanced metallurgy that allowed the creation of superior weapons and tools, astronomical knowledge that went beyond simple observation of natural cycles, medical practices with plants that included substances too powerful to have been discovered by trial and error. Notice the pattern. These are exactly the types of knowledge that the texts of Enoch attribute to the Watchers. Azazel would have taught metallurgy and the manufacture of weapons, Barakijal, astronomy, Semjaza, sorcery and medicine with herbs. If these lineage traditions have any foundation, then it is possible that the women functioned as receptacles and transmitters of the angelic teachings. But here arises a contradiction that deserves attention. If this knowledge was considered part of the original transgression, why was it preserved? Why did religious communities that viewed the union between angels and humans as a moral catastrophe maintain practices derived from that union? In late versions of texts on wisdom and ritual practices, there are indications of a complicated answer. The knowledge did not disappear because it was too useful to be eliminated completely. Superior metallurgy saves lives in wars. Precise astronomy guides navigation and agriculture. Effective medicine cures diseases that would kill without intervention. The problem was not the technical utility, it was the origin. And here appears a pattern that we find in various ancient traditions. Knowledge considered dangerous by origin, but maintained by practical necessity. The solution, in many cases, was to preserve it through specific lineages that carried both the knowledge and the associated stigma. Try to visualize how this would work in practice. The women who had been wives of the Watchers possessed teachings that no other human person mastered. They knew how to work metals in a way that produced more resistant alloys. They knew which plants combined created powerful remedies or toxic substances. They knew how to interpret celestial movements in ways that allowed predicting events with uncommon precision. This knowledge made them simultaneously valuable and dangerous. Valuable because they mastered techniques that could benefit the community. Dangerous because they carried knowledge associated with the original transgression. The solution seems to have been to keep them in a specific social position, neither totally integrated nor totally excluded. Some preserved manuscripts suggest that they became something like marginal specialists. People whom the community sought when it needed specific knowledge, but who did not occupy central positions in the normal social structure. It is a pattern we find in other cultures. Healers, specialized smiths, astronomers, people who master arts considered necessary but also suspicious. The difference in the case of the wives of the Watchers is that the suspicion did not come only from the type of knowledge, but from its origin. These were not arts that could be learned by any dedicated person. They were teachings that had arrived through a specific transgression. This created a unique category, useful knowledge with a problematic genealogy. And here enters an element that complicated their situation even further: the children. Even after the elimination of the giants, the memory of what they had done remained alive. In ancient accounts transmitted in fragmented form, the giants are described not only as violent predators, but as systematic corruptors of the natural order. Think about this. The mothers had seen their own sons transform into the main threat to human survival. They had watched creatures they themselves bore devour resources, terrorize communities, break all rules of coexistence that kept society functioning. The psychological trauma of this experience is difficult to imagine, but there is something even more disturbing in the reconstruction that the texts allow. If we accept the tradition that the spirits of the giants remained active after physical death, then the mothers did not have the right even to normal mourning. They could not weep for children who had died and disappeared. They had to deal with the idea that what they bore continued existing, only now in a totally hostile form. Certain traditions preserved in later manuscripts make reference to specific practices of protection against spiritual afflictions that would have originated in this period. Rituals of purification, amulets against nightmares, techniques of exorcism, ways to identify and neutralize demonic influences. And some of these traditions suggest that the original mothers were the first to develop these methods. Follow the logic. If anyone knew how to deal with the afflicting spirits of the giants, it was the people who had direct experience with them. The women who had seen the sons grow, who had observed their transformation from hybrid children into uncontrolled predators, who had witnessed the death and then felt the persistent presence of the spirits. This suggests that they may have developed a specific social function, specialists in protection against the spiritual consequences of the very transgression in which they had participated. It is a bitter irony, but one that makes sense within the logic of the texts. Who better to teach how to protect oneself from demons than those who had given origin to the demons? In marginal notes of preserved copies, there are indications that certain lineages maintain specific oral traditions about signs of spiritual affliction and methods of cleansing. These were not fantastic magical practices, but concrete techniques. How to identify when someone was being influenced by hostile forces, how to purify environments where there was demonic presence, how to protect children against nightmares that were not just bad dreams. Notice how this would fit perfectly into the ambiguous position the texts suggest for them. They were not viewed as saints or wise women in the positive sense. They were viewed as people who carried necessary knowledge but derived from traumatic experience. It was knowledge that no one wanted to have, but that someone needed to master to protect the community. And here arises another aspect of the investigation that deserves attention: the way different traditions dealt with this complicated heritage. Some communities seem to have developed practices of containment, keeping the carriers of this knowledge isolated but accessible when necessary. Others developed practices of purification, trying to separate the useful knowledge from the problematic origin through specific rituals. There are indications that some traditions tried a different approach, reinterpreting the origin of the knowledge. In later versions of certain texts, the useful teachings are attributed not to the fallen angels, but to faithful angels who would have corrected or purified what had been corrupted. It is a theologically elegant solution, but one that creates new narrative problems. If the knowledge was corrected by good angels, why did the women who carried it continue to be viewed with suspicion? If the problematic origin had been resolved, why were they not reintegrated normally into society? The contradictions suggest that these reinterpretations were later attempts to solve a problem that the original tradition had created: useful knowledge with unacceptable genealogy. But perhaps the most interesting clue about the real destiny of the women appears in a different line of investigation: the way later traditions dealt with marriages between people of different natures. In preserved texts regarding matrimonial laws and ritual purity, there are specific rules about unions that cross boundaries, natural or spiritual. These rules suggest that the episode of the Watchers created a precedent that influenced generations of religious thought. The idea that certain unions, even when seductive or advantageous, can have consequences that extend far beyond those directly involved, and that women, as the point of contact in these unions, carry a specific responsibility for the consequences. It is not that they are guilty of the original transgression that continues to be attributed to the angels, but they are viewed as carriers of the long-term consequences. In certain manuscripts, there are references to marked lineages that need special purifications before participating in community rituals. They are not permanently excluded, but they carry a mark that demands specific ritual attention. Think of the psychological complexity of this situation. The women had not only lost children in a traumatic way, they had become living symbols of spiritual danger. Every time someone in the community suffered an inexplicable affliction, they were reminded that the spirits of their sons might be involved. Every time someone questioned the origin of a useful knowledge, they were reminded that they had been the channel for problematic teachings. It is a form of survival, but survival marked by permanent responsibility for consequences they had no way of foreseeing when they accepted the angelic seduction. In terms of human justice, it is a brutal situation. In terms of mythical function, it is a perfect warning. Seductions that seem advantageous can create responsibilities that traverse generations. And here appears a pattern that we find in various ancient traditions when they deal with transgressions that have collective consequences. The focus is not on individual justice, but on the prevention of future repetitions. The women became part of a warning system. Their lives served as an example of what happens when certain boundaries are crossed. Some traditions, preserved in fragments, suggest that they developed specific practices to deal with this responsibility. Rituals of containment to keep the angelic knowledge under control. Practices of purification to neutralize hostile spiritual influences. Techniques of protection to prevent other people from repeating the same mistakes. In a certain sense, they became guardians of boundaries. Not in the sense of preventing others from crossing them, but in the sense of demonstrating the consequences of crossing them. Their very existence functioned as a living warning. Angelic seductions produce sons who become threats. Forbidden knowledge comes with permanent responsibilities. Certain choices have consequences that extend far beyond the person who makes them. But there is another aspect of the reconstruction that complicates the picture even further. The possibility that some of them may have become themselves a source of dangerous seductions. if they carried knowledge that others did not possess, if they mastered techniques that could offer significant advantages, it is likely that they attracted people willing to take risks to gain access to these teachings. In late versions of texts on temptations and corruptions, there are indications that carriers of angelic knowledge were sought by people who wanted shortcuts to power, wealth, or superhuman capabilities, and that some of the original mothers may have become, consciously or not, the source of new minor transgressions. This created a vicious cycle. They carried the responsibility for the consequences of the original transgression, but they could also become responsible for new derived transgressions. Each person who sought angelic knowledge through them was, on a small scale, repeating the pattern that had created the original problem, humans seeking access to capabilities they should not possess. And here enters an element that appears in various traditions, but always indirectly: the idea that angelic knowledge, once transmitted, cannot be completely eliminated. It can be contained, purified, controlled, but it cannot be forgotten. This means that the women did not have the option to simply forget what they knew and return to normal life. Certain lineages are mentioned in later manuscripts as guardians of dangerous secrets. They are not celebrated for this. They are recognized as necessary, but also as a permanent source of risk. It is a unique social position, indispensable and undesirable at the same time. The most plausible reconstruction, based on the available fragments, is that they developed a specific subculture, not totally separated from general society, but also not totally integrated. They maintained knowledge that was sought when necessary, but carried marks that made them socially problematic. It is possible that they developed their own rituals, their own community practices, their own ways of transmitting knowledge from generation to generation, not as a rebellion against the social order, but as an adaptation to a position that the social order had created for them. In some preserved traditions, there are references to women who know things they should not know and who are sought in moments of crisis, but avoided in normal times. It is a pattern we find in various cultures. Marginal specialists whom society keeps at a distance, but also keeps available. Notice how this resolves some of the narrative problems the texts create. If the women had been punished with death or total exile, the angelic knowledge would have disappeared. If they had been reintegrated normally, the warning function of the story would be lost. The solution that seems to have emerged preserves both utility and caution, keeping the carriers alive and accessible, but in a position that constantly reinforces the dangers of similar transgressions. And perhaps this is the most disturbing aspect of the entire reconstruction. The women became part of a social system that used their own lives as an educational tool. They were not just people who had gone through a traumatic experience. They were living examples of the dangers of certain choices. Their daily existence served to remind the community that some seductions have lasting consequences. This explains why the texts do not give them detailed biographies or specific destinies. They were not individual characters in a story that had ended. They were active components of a warning system that needed to continue functioning. Giving them too many individual characteristics could generate empathy that would complicate the didactic function. Keeping them as a category preserves the educational effect. It is an efficient narrative solution, but one that has a brutal human cost. The real women, if there were real women behind the tradition, lose the right to individuality to serve as collective symbols. And this is not presented as an injustice to be corrected, but as a necessity to be accepted for the good of the community. Follow the final logic. If the objective is to prevent future generations from repeating transgressions that can have cosmic consequences, then keeping living witnesses of this transgression is an investment in collective security. The women become part of the moral infrastructure of the community, a permanent presence that constantly reinforces certain lessons without needing to be explained in detail. And perhaps that is exactly what the texts are preserving when they choose silence regarding their specific destinies. It is not a narrative failure, it is an educational strategy. What happened to them is less important than the function they continue to exercise in the collective memory of the community. The story of the wives of the Watchers does not end with them. In fact, it has only begun. What these women became, marginal specialists carrying dangerous knowledge, created a model that reverberated through centuries of religious tradition. When we trace later manuscripts, we find echoes of this figure in completely different contexts. Women who master suspicious arts, lineages that carry problematic knowledge, practices that are useful but morally ambiguous. It is as if the tradition had created an archetype, the woman who knows too much. Not because she sought forbidden knowledge on her own, but because she was seduced to cross boundaries she should not have crossed. And once those boundaries are crossed, there is no return. The knowledge remains, but it carries forever the mark of its transgressive origin. In preserved texts regarding mystical practices of later periods, there are frequent references to ancient traditions that date back to the first times. These are not direct references to the episode of the Watchers, but when we examine them carefully, the patterns are unmistakable. Knowledge of angelic origin, techniques that were taught, not discovered, practices that require specific lineage because they cannot be learned by just any person. Notice how this drastically amplifies the impact of the original story. The women who married fallen angels did not create just a problem localized in time. They created a lasting category of knowledge and a lasting category of people. And this category continued reproducing itself, not genetically necessarily, but culturally. There are indications that certain later traditions developed specific criteria to identify carriers of angelic inheritance. These were not fantastic physical marks, but behavioral patterns and capabilities that suggested access to non-human teachings, intuitive mastery of complex metallurgy, astronomical knowledge that went beyond what could be learned by normal observation, capacity to work with plants in a way that produced exceptional medicinal or toxic effects. It is possible that some of these traditions became, themselves, ways of perpetuating the social division that the original story had created. If certain families were recognized as descendants of the original mothers, this placed them automatically in the same ambiguous position, useful when necessary, suspicious by association. But there is another dimension of the investigation that is even more disturbing. The way the tradition of the wives of the Watchers influenced later concepts regarding marriage itself. In preserved manuscripts regarding matrimonial laws, there are specific rules that seem directly inspired by the original episode. Prohibitions against unions that mix different natures, requirements of ritual purification before marriages between lineages considered problematic, warnings against seductions that offer supernatural advantages. Try to visualize how this would work in practice. A woman who mastered advanced metallurgy would be automatically suspected of carrying angelic inheritance. A man who demonstrated exceptional astronomical knowledge would be questioned about the origin of his knowledge. Marriages between these people and normal lineages would require special rituals to neutralize possible spiritual contaminations. These were not measures based on casual prejudices. They were elaborate systems of protection against the repetition of the original disaster. The community had learned that certain seductions, especially those involving access to superhuman capabilities, can have consequences that extend for generations. The solution was to develop ways to identify and control these situations before they escalated. And here appears a pattern that we find in various later traditions, the institutionalization of marginality. The original women had been pushed into a specific social position by exceptional circumstances, but later traditions transformed this position into a recognized and regulated category. Certain preserved traditions make reference to specific orders or houses for people who carry knowledge of problematic origin. They are not described as punishments, but as forms of social organization that recognize the need to keep certain knowledge available, but controlled. It is the institutionalization of ambiguity, useful enough to be preserved, dangerous enough to be integrated normally. Some of these traditions developed elaborate practices of gradual purification. The idea was that knowledge of angelic origin could be slowly humanized through generations of correct ritual use. It was not elimination of the knowledge, but transformation of its moral nature through careful application and purified intention. It is a theologically sophisticated solution, but one that creates new practical problems. If the knowledge can be purified, why do the people who carry it continue to be treated as suspicious? If the problematic origin can be corrected, why does the social mark persist? The contradictions suggest that these solutions were more aspirational than effective. But perhaps the most lasting influence of the tradition of the Wives of the Watchers was on the formation of concepts regarding forbidden knowledge in general. The idea that certain knowledge is intrinsically dangerous, not because it is technically difficult, but because it has a transgressive origin, and that people who master this knowledge carry a specific moral responsibility for the consequences of its use. In later traditions regarding magic, alchemy, and mystical practices, there is a consistent pattern. Powerful knowledge demands appropriate lineage or specific initiation, not because it is technically impossible to learn otherwise, but because it carries spiritual risks that can only be handled by people prepared to deal with the consequences. And here enters an element that complicates the picture even further: the possibility that some of the descendants may have become consciously perpetuators of the transgressive tradition. If they carried angelic knowledge, and if their social position was marginal anyway, why not fully explore the advantages of this knowledge? Certain traditions preserved in fragments make reference to hidden schools that would have maintained angelic teachings in pure form without the attempts at purification that conventional religious communities promoted. These are not schools of fantastic magic, but groups that preserved specific techniques: advanced military metallurgy, medicine with powerful substances, astronomy applied to the prediction of political events. It is possible that some of these traditions became, themselves, a source of new transgressions. If angelic knowledge offered real advantages, and apparently it did, then there would always be people willing to take risks to gain access to it, and the original carriers could become intermediaries in these transactions. This created a cycle that continuously reproduced the original problem: humans seeking access to capabilities they should not possess, mediated by people who carried the mark of previous transgressions. Each new transmission of angelic knowledge was, on a small scale, a repetition of the pattern that had generated the catastrophe of the giants. And here arises one of the most interesting clues about how the tradition evolved: the way later texts deal with the idea of auxiliary spirits in mystical practices. In various traditions, there are references to spiritual entities that can be invoked to help in specific works, but that require special care because their nature is ambiguous. Some of these auxiliary spirits are described with characteristics that strongly resemble the spirits of the giants: powerful but hostile by nature, useful for certain purposes but dangerous to handle, capable of offering exceptional knowledge or capabilities, but always charging unexpected prices. It is possible that these traditions evolved directly from the practices that the wives of the Watchers developed to deal with the spirits of their own sons. If they had learned to work with these entities, not eliminate them, because that was impossible, but control them or direct them for specific purposes, then this experience may have become the basis of later mystical traditions. Notice how this would completely change our understanding of what happened to the women. Instead of being simply victims or passive witnesses of a catastrophe, they may have become the first specialists in practical demonology. People who developed techniques to deal with hostile spiritual entities because they had no choice. The spirits of the sons were there, they were dangerous, but they were also powerful. In later traditions regarding exorcism and spiritual protection, there are techniques that are described as ancient and that involve not the elimination of hostile entities, but negotiation with them. The idea is that certain spiritual forces are too powerful to be simply banished, but can be controlled or directed if the person knows the correct methods. These techniques require specific knowledge about the nature of the entities involved, about the types of contract they accept, about the forms of protection necessary during the process. It is exactly the type of knowledge that the wives of the Watchers would have been forced to develop. How to deal with powerful and hostile beings that cannot be eliminated, but that need to be handled. And here enters another disturbing possibility. Perhaps some of the women discovered that they could use the spirits of their own sons as tools in certain circumstances. If these spirits were a source of affliction for other humans, but had some type of residual bond with the mothers, then the mothers could have developed ways to direct them against specific enemies or to use their power for defensive purposes. This would explain why later traditions regarding maternal magic, specific mystical practices associated with women who had lost children in a traumatic way, frequently include elements of invoking protective spirits that are described as simultaneously familiar and dangerous. We are not talking about fantasy, we are talking about elaborate systems of beliefs and practices that evolved to deal with specific traumatic situations. If a woman believed that the spirit of her dead son continued to be present and hostile, she needed to develop ways to deal with that presence. The techniques she developed could then be transmitted to other women in similar situations. Some preserved traditions suggest that certain lineages specialized in work with difficult familiar spirits. These were not practices celebrated publicly, but they were recognized as necessary in specific circumstances. And the expertise in these practices came from direct experience with traumatic loss and persistent spiritual presence. But there is another aspect of the lasting influence that deserves attention. The way the tradition of the wives of the Watchers shaped concepts regarding female responsibility in contexts of spiritual transgression. In later texts regarding temptation and fall, there is a consistent pattern. Women are presented as especially vulnerable to seductions that offer knowledge or power, but also as especially responsible for the long-term consequences of these seductions. It is not simple victim blaming, it is recognition of a specific function. The idea is that women, as points of contact between different spheres of reality, human and divine, physical and spiritual, individual and communal, have a special capacity both to facilitate transgressions and to manage their consequences. This is a complicated view that does not fit into modern categories of victim or culprit. Women are viewed as agents with real capacity for choice, but also as people who carry specific responsibilities because of the position they occupy in the cosmic order. It is responsibility that comes with power, but power that comes with risks. And perhaps that is exactly what the tradition was trying to preserve. not a story about specific women who suffered specific consequences, but a model for understanding how certain social and spiritual positions create both opportunities and special responsibilities. The wives of the Watchers became an archetype for anyone who occupies a boundary position between worlds. In later traditions regarding mystical marriage, spiritual union between humans and non-human entities, there are elaborate rules that seem directly inspired by the original story. Practices of protection before the union, rituals of purification during the process, methods of containment of the consequences, techniques to deal with hybrid descent that may result from these relationships. These are not literal practices. They are symbolic systems for dealing with any situation where a person seeks union or knowledge from sources that are beyond normal human experience. But the methods are concrete and specific, suggesting that they evolved from real practical experience with problematic situations. And here we reach the final aspect of our investigation: the possibility that the wives of the Watchers became, in fact, the founders of an entire tradition of knowledge regarding dangerous boundaries, not only in the mystical sense, but in the practical sense of understanding when certain opportunities are disguised seductions, when certain knowledge comes with hidden prices, when certain advantages create problematic dependencies. It is knowledge that any society needs, but that is difficult to teach in an abstract way. It works better when transmitted through specific stories, concrete examples, traditions that preserve both the benefits and the risks of certain choices. The story of the wives of the Watchers offers all of this. Seduction that seems advantageous, knowledge that is genuinely useful, consequences that extend far beyond the people involved, and practical methods to deal with the complications that arise. It is a complete manual for navigating situations where normal human desire for knowledge, power, special capabilities encounters opportunities that come with hidden risks. And perhaps that is why the tradition preserved the women not as individual biographies, but as a functional category. They represent anyone who accepts seductions that seem beneficial, but that come with lasting responsibilities. Their specific story is less important than the position they occupy in the warning system that the tradition created. In this sense, their destiny was not something that happened in the past and ended. It is something that continues happening every time someone finds themselves in the position of having to choose between immediate advantages and long-term risks, between useful knowledge and problematic responsibilities, between normal social integration and marginal specialization. The wives of the Watchers became a mirror where the tradition can examine its own temptations and its own choices. And perhaps that is exactly what the texts were trying to create, not a historical account about specific people, but a lasting tool for understanding the dangers and responsibilities that come with the human desire to transcend normal limitations.